The morning after my grandfather's funeral, I stood on his front porch, and I had no idea that someone inside that house was already calculating what his land was worth per acre. I remember the way the light came across the fields that morning. That flat, pale Indiana light that comes in low and slow in early March. I could smell the old wood of the porch, the cold air, the kind of quiet that only exists that far outside of town. I was trying to hold on to something, trying to stay in that place for just a little longer before the world started moving again. And I did not know, I genuinely did not know, that while I was standing there doing that, someone had already made a phone call. Someone had already started a conversation that was never supposed to happen without me. What followed was months of careful watching. Months of knowing something that I didn't fully understand yet, and then understanding it completely, and saying nothing. And then one Tuesday morning, I walked into a closing meeting with a single document, a deed transfer my grandfather had signed in 1998, and I watched everything Diane had spent months building come apart in less than half an hour. That is the story I want to tell you today. But before I take you back to where all of this really started, I'd be happy to know that where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments, I always read them. To understand what happened, you have to understand what that farm meant to me. Not in a general way, not just, it was special, or it held memories. I mean, you have to understand it specifically, the way you understand a place that shaped you before you were old enough to know you were being shaped. Harold Carter's farm sat on 40 acres of flat Indiana land about 20 miles outside of a town called Millhaven. If you drove past it without knowing anything about it, you would not think twice. A white farmhouse that needed paint. A red barn that had been repainted so many times the color had gone slightly orange in places. A gravel driveway that ran about 150 yards from the road to the house, lined on one side by a row of old oak trees that my great-grandfather planted when he built the place in the 1940s. From the road, it looked like every other working farm in that part of Indiana. Unremarkable, functional, easy to pass. But if you had spent your summers there as a child, the way I did, it looked completely different. It looked like the only place in the world where time moved at a pace you could actually live inside. My parents divorced when I was 9 years old. I want to be careful about how I describe that, because I'm not interested in blaming anyone. It was a long time ago, and I've made my peace with most of it. But I will say that it was not a quiet divorce. It was the kind that happens in stages, each one louder than the last, until the silence at the end of it was almost as hard to live in as the noise had been. My mother and I stayed in the house in Fort Wayne. My father moved into an apartment across town. And the life I had known, dinner at a set time, both parents in the same room, the particular ordinary texture of a family that is still intact, that life just stopped one day without any clear announcement that it was ending. I was 9. I didn't have the language for what I was feeling. I just knew that something had been removed from the foundation of things, and the whole structure felt unsteady. And then that first summer, my mother put me on a Greyhound bus to Millhaven with a duffel bag and a paper bag of snacks, and my grandfather Harold was standing at the station when I got off. He was 63 that year. Tall, lean, with hands that looked like they had been built specifically for outdoor work, which essentially they had. He didn't make a big production of picking me up. He took my bag, said, "Good, you made it," and drove me to the farm. That was it. That was the whole greeting. And somehow, after the year I had just had, that was exactly right. The farm had a rhythm to it that I had never experienced anywhere else. Harold woke at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. By the time I came downstairs at 7, the coffee was already made, and there was something on the stove, eggs or oatmeal, or on weekends sometimes bacon and toast. He did not hover. He did not pepper me with questions about how I was feeling or how my mother was doing or whether I was adjusting. He just made breakfast and set a place at the table and got on with the day. And somehow, in the absence of all that anxious attention, I started to breathe again. He taught me things that summer. Real, practical things. How to read the sky, how a certain kind of cloud formation coming from the west meant rain by afternoon, and how you could feel the change in the air pressure before the temperature dropped. How to fix a fence post properly, which takes longer than you think because you have to pack the ground right around the base, or it won't hold. How to drive his old Ford pickup. This was when I was 14, a few summers later on the dirt road behind the barn where there was nothing to hit and nothing to worry about. He sat in the passenger seat with one arm out the window and said almost nothing. Just brake earlier and you're fine. And occasionally, that's it, that's exactly it, when I got something right. I think about that a lot, actually. How much of what he taught me was about the farm and how much of it was something else entirely, about patience, about paying attention, about doing things at the right pace rather than the fastest pace. He never said any of that directly. Harold Carter was not a man who delivered life lessons. He just did things the right way and let you watch. The summers at the farm became the architecture of my childhood in a way I didn't fully recognize until I was an adult. When things were hard at home, and there were years when things were genuinely hard, when my mother was struggling financially, and the apartment felt small and the tension between her and my father bled into every corner of our lives, even after they were no longer living in the same house. I held onto those summers. The smell of that kitchen in the morning. The particular way the light came through the trees along the driveway at the end of the day. The front porch after dinner, Harold in his chair and me on the steps, not talking much, just being there together while the fields went dark. It was enough. It was more than enough. I want to say something here that might sound strange. Harold wasn't a warm man, not in the conventional sense. He didn't say, "I love you" easily. He didn't hug you every time you walked in the door. There were people in my extended family who found him difficult, too quiet, too blunt, not interested enough in the social rituals that make family gatherings run smoothly. But the thing about Harold was that he was completely, utterly reliable. He was the same person every single time you encountered him. He did not have moods that changed the temperature of a room. He did not say one thing and do another. What he told you was true. What he promised, he kept. For a child who had grown up in a household defined by instability and unpredictability, that consistency was worth more than any amount of warmth. He was, without question, the most trustworthy person I have ever known. I kept those summers going even after I grew up. After college, after I moved to Columbus and started building my own life, I drove back to the farm at least twice a year. Usually Memorial Day weekend and again sometime in the fall around harvest time, when the light in Indiana has that particular quality that I've never found anywhere else. And I called Harold every Sunday. Not out of obligation, not because I felt guilty if I didn't, genuinely because I wanted to. Those Sunday calls were 20, sometimes 30 minutes long. He'd tell me what was happening with the land, what needed fixing, what the neighbors were up to. I'd tell him about work, about Columbus, about whatever I was navigating that week. It wasn't dramatic conversation. It was the steady, low-frequency hum of two people who genuinely liked each other staying connected across distance. I'm aware, and I was aware even then, that my father Robert did not have the same relationship with Harold. Robert visited the farm maybe once a year, sometimes less. His calls were shorter, less frequent, more obligatory in their feel. I never judged him for it, not really, because I understood that whatever ease I had with Harold was something Robert had never quite found. Their relationship had a formality to it that I couldn't penetrate from the outside, and I never tried to. It was their dynamic to navigate. What I will say is that the gap between how Robert engaged with his father and how I engaged with mine became more visible once Diane came into the picture. Robert met Diane 9 years ago at some kind of work function. An industry dinner, I think. He called me 2 weeks later to tell me he'd met someone and that he wanted me to meet her when I was next in Fort Wayne. His voice on that call had a quality I hadn't heard from him in years, lighter, almost surprised at himself. I was glad for him. I genuinely was. My parents' divorce had been hard on him too. in ways he never really talked about, and the years after it had been lonely ones. He deserved to find someone. I met for the first time about 2 months later, at a dinner at my father's house. She was 51 at the time. Professionally dressed even for a casual dinner, not overdressed, just put together in a way that suggested she was always conscious of how she presented herself. She had short, dark hair and the kind of posture that comes either from a strict upbringing or from years of paying attention to how you carry yourself. She asked me thoughtful questions about my work, remembered the details I mentioned and referenced them later in the conversation, laughed at the right moments. She was, by any objective measure, excellent company. I didn't dislike her. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy, in hindsight, to rewrite my first impression of as something more suspicious than it actually was. I was cautious. The way anyone who grew up in a divorced household tends to be cautious about new partners, but I was fair. I gave her a genuine chance. I told myself that my father was an adult who knew his own mind, and that whatever reservations I carried were mine to manage, not hers to answer for. And for a while, that seemed like the right call. But over the next few years, a pattern started to emerge. Not anything dramatic, nothing I could have pointed to in the moment and said, there, that's it. It was more of a cumulative impression, the way that water, given enough time, will leave a mark on stone. Talked about money constantly. Not crudely, not in the way that would make you visibly uncomfortable at a dinner table. But always. Every family decision, where to take a vacation, whether to repair or replace something in the house, what to do with a piece of property my father owned, what made sense from a financial planning perspective. Everything passed through that filter. She had an opinion on every dollar that moved in their household, and she was not shy about sharing it. I'm not saying that's wrong, exactly. Financial awareness is not a character flaw, but there was something about the consistency of it, the way it was always there running underneath everything, that started to feel like a kind of orientation. Like it was the organizing principle of how she moved through the world. The Thanksgiving that stands out most in my memory was about 4 years into their marriage. Robert and drove to the farm for the holiday, one of the few times actually made the trip out, and I was there for the long weekend. The first day was fine. The second day, I noticed that kept slipping away from the main conversation and walking the property. Not in a curious, this is a nice farm kind of way. In a methodical way. She walked the perimeter of the back field. She stood at the far end of the eastern acre for a while, looking back toward the house. At one point, I saw her packing off distances near the barn, which was a strange thing to do on a holiday weekend. That evening at dinner, she asked Harold a series of questions. How many acres was the property total? Was there a creek or any water feature running through it? Had the land ever been surveyed for mineral rights? Had he ever had it formally appraised? Harold answered every question directly, without hurry, without giving any indication that he found the questions unusual or intrusive. He told her 40 acres, no water feature worth noting, no mineral survey he knew of, and no, he had never had a formal appraisal done. He said the last part simply, as a statement of fact, not as an invitation to continue the conversation. Later that night, after dinner was cleared and Robert had gone upstairs, Harold and I were in the kitchen. I was drying dishes. He was putting things away, and without looking at me he said, quietly, "She counts things." That was it, 3 words. He didn't elaborate and I didn't ask him to. I actually laughed a little softly and said something like, "She's thorough. I'll give her that." Harold made a sound that might have been agreement and moved on to the next thing. I didn't think about it much after that weekend. It was just one of those Harold observations, precise, understated, filed away without drama. I didn't understand at the time that he was telling me something important. If you've ever experienced something like this, that particular feeling of being in a room with someone and sensing that they are measuring things that aren't theirs to measure yet, feel free to mention it in the comments. I genuinely love reading every single one. The next 2 years brought Harold's illness. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure when he was 81, in the late fall during a routine appointment with his doctor in. He called me himself to tell me, didn't have Robert call, didn't have a neighbor relay the message. Just called on a Sunday, earlier than usual, and told me what the doctor had said. His voice was the same as it always was. He was not alarmed. He told me the medication options, what the management plan looked like, and what the doctor had said about reasonable expectations. He gave me the information the same way he gave me everything, straight, without decoration, trusting me to handle it. The first year was genuinely manageable. He adjusted his activity levels, took his medications consistently, and kept doing most of what he had always done on the farm. I increased my visits, driving out most months instead of just twice a year, and I started handling small things he used to do himself. Organizing his prescriptions, making sure the bigger physical repairs on the property were contracted out rather than attempted by an 81-year-old man with a heart condition. He let me do this without complaint, which was its own kind of acknowledgement that things had changed. Robert visited a few times during that first year. Came once briefly for a weekend that felt more administrative than personal. She spent part of one afternoon on her laptop at the kitchen table, which Harold noticed and said nothing about. After that visit, her presence at the farm effectively stopped. There was always a reason: work, a prior commitment, something that needed her attention elsewhere. I didn't comment on it. It wasn't my marriage and it wasn't my place. But I noticed. The second year of Harold's illness was harder. His energy levels dropped more significantly. He tired easily. There were days when the stairs were more effort than they should have been, and days when he simply sat on the porch in the morning rather than walking the property the way he had his entire adult life. He was still himself, still sharp, still precise, still Harold in every way that mattered. But the body was doing what bodies do, and we both knew it. It was during a visit in late January, about 14 months before he died, that the kitchen table conversation happened. We had finished dinner. I had made soup, something simple, and he had eaten well, which I always took as a good sign. The dishes were done. It was dark outside by 5:30 at that time of year, and the kitchen was warm and quiet. Harold asked me to sit back down at the table, and something in the way he said it made me sit without the usual small talk first. He got up, went to the shelf in the hallway where he kept his important papers, and came back with a manila envelope, sealed. He set it on the table and slid it across to me. He said there was something I needed to know about the farm, and that I should keep the envelope somewhere safe and not leave it at the house. I remember looking at the envelope and then looking at him and feeling something tighten in my chest that I did not want to name. I told him not to talk like that. I told him he still had time, that we didn't need to be doing this yet. Harold looked at me for a moment with that steady, unhurried patience that was as much a part of him as his hands or his voice. And he said, "I'm not talking about dying. I'm talking about making sure things stay where they belong." I took the envelope home to Columbus 2 days later. I put it in the filing cabinet in my home office, in the hanging folder labeled important documents that I had set up years ago and rarely actually used. And I did not open it. Looking back, I know why. I understood on some level, not consciously, but in the way that you sometimes know things before you let yourself know them, what was likely inside that envelope. Some kind of legal document. Something Harold had organized on my behalf. Something that was a preparation, even if he refused to call it that. And opening it would have meant accepting that he was preparing for something. That his time was finite in a way that was now specific and documented rather than abstract and distant. I was not ready to hold that, so I filed it away, and I called him the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and I let myself believe there was still more time than there probably was. He died on a Thursday morning in early March, about 14 months after that conversation. My father called me just after 7 in the morning. I remember I was still in my kitchen, hadn't finished my coffee yet. I sat down on the floor with my back against the cabinet. I don't even know why, I just did, and I stayed there for a while after the call ended. I drove to Indiana that afternoon. The days that followed had that particular texture that grief has when it's mixed with logistics, the kind of grief where you cannot fully stop and feel it, because there is always something that needs to be handled next. The funeral home, the death certificates, the calls to people who needed to know, neighbors and family showing up at the farmhouse with food, the way people do in small Indiana towns, so that by the third day the refrigerator was full of casseroles and we were running out of places to put them. Was present through all of it, and I will say this honestly, she was efficient. She took calls, organized the reception after the service, made sure the right people were in the right order, kept track of the catering and the seating and the logistics of a family gathering that neither my father nor I were in any state to manage. She handled it all with the same composed competence she brought to everything. At the time, I experienced this as helpfulness, as a capable person stepping up when she was needed. Later, much later, I would think back on those days and understand that efficiency and helpfulness are not always the same thing. That a person can be moving through a situation with purpose and still have a destination in mind that has nothing to do with supporting you. Was not just helping during those days after Harold's funeral. She was already moving. It would take me another 10 days to start seeing it clearly. But looking back now, I think the movement had already begun before we even buried him. I stayed at the farm for 2 weeks after the funeral. That wasn't the original plan. I had booked a few days, assuming I would drive back to Columbus once the immediate logistics were handled. But my father was struggling more than I had anticipated, and the house needed sorting, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't ready to leave either. There was something about being in that space, even emptied of Harold's presence, that felt necessary. Like if I left too soon, I would be closing a door I wasn't ready to close. So I stayed. I slept in my old room, the small one at the top of the stairs with the window that looked out over the eastern field, and I worked through Harold's belongings slowly, methodically, the way he would have wanted it done. Not rushed, not careless. His clothes, his papers, the tools in the barn that needed. I made lists. I labeled boxes. I kept my hands busy because keeping my hands busy was the only way I knew to keep moving forward through those particular days. My father was in and out. He was staying at the farm too, at least for that first week, but he was not in a state to be particularly useful, which I didn't hold against him. Robert grieves by going quiet and distant and slightly absent, which is not so different from how he moves through most difficult things, but grief makes the quality of it more visible. He would sit in Harold's chair in the living room for long stretches without reading or watching anything. He would start a sentence and not finish it. I brought him coffee and sat with him sometimes, and we didn't talk much, which was fine. That kind of company is its own form of support. Drove back to Fort Wayne 3 days after the funeral. She said she had things she needed to get back to, work commitments, appointments that couldn't be moved. She hugged my father at the door, told him to call her if he needed anything, told me it had been good to have me there. Then she got in her car and drove away, and the farm felt immediately, perceptibly quieter. Not in a bad way necessarily, just different, like the pressure in the room had adjusted. I noticed that I felt relieved, and then I noticed that I felt slightly guilty for feeling relieved, and then I decided to set both of those feelings down and get back to the boxes in the spare bedroom. It was 10 days after the funeral, a Wednesday, overcast, the kind of gray Indiana day that feels like it could produce rain but probably won't, that I first saw the car. I was in the kitchen washing out some jars I'd found in the back of Harold's pantry, the old glass canning kind that he had kept for decades and never quite gotten rid of. The kitchen window looks straight down the driveway toward the road, and movement along that gravel line catches your eye naturally because there is not much else moving in that landscape on a quiet weekday. So when the car turned in off the road and came slowly up toward the house, I noticed it immediately. It was a clean, dark sedan, late model, well-maintained, not the kind of car that belonged to a neighbor or a local. There was something in the rear window, a placard of some kind, the rectangular kind that real estate agencies use to mark their vehicles. It came about halfway up the driveway and then stopped. Just sat there for a minute or two, engine presumably running. I could see the driver was looking toward the house, and then toward the barn, and then out along the side field. Then, without coming any further, it reversed slowly and pulled back out onto the road and drove away. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment after it was gone. Then I dried my hands and went back to the jars. That evening, when my father and I were eating dinner, reheated casserole from one of the neighbors, something with chicken and rice that was better than it had any right to be, I mentioned it. I kept my voice casual. I said I'd seen a car come partway up the driveway that morning, one of those real estate agency vehicles, and that it had sat for a minute before driving off. I said I thought it was a little strange and asked if he knew anything about it. My father said it was probably just someone turning around, that the driveway was long and visible from the road, and people used it sometimes when they needed to reverse direction. He said it while looking at his plate. He did not look up. He took another forkful of casserole and moved the conversation toward something else, whether the furnace needed a service before the property was closed up, I think. I let it go. I filed the moment away and let it go. 2 days later, a second vehicle. This one was an SUV, larger, dark-colored, with no visible signage but with that same quality of newness and cleanliness that signals a professional vehicle rather than a personal one. It came further up the driveway than the first car had. It parked near the barn and 2 people got out, a man and a woman, both in what looked like business casual clothing, and they stood together for several minutes. They looked at the barn. They looked at the back field. The man had something in his hand, a phone or a small tablet, and he was moving it slowly as though he was either taking photos or making notes or both. They did not come to the door. They did not knock or introduce themselves or give any indication that they were aware anyone was watching from the house. After about 20 minutes, they got back in the SUV and left. I watched all of this from the living room window, standing slightly back from the glass, the way you do when you don't want to be seen watching. My father was upstairs. I did not go up and tell him what I had seen. Something about the way he had responded to the first car, the not looking up, the too quick explanation, the immediate redirect, had told me that telling him again would produce the same result, and that the result itself was information I needed to sit with rather than challenge directly. So I stood at that window until the SUV was gone, and then I went back to what I had been doing, and I thought about it quietly for the rest of the day. I stayed 2 more days at the farm after that. I finished the boxes in the spare bedroom. I organized Harold's filing system, his actual paper files, the ones in the old metal cabinet in the room he used as an office, and I made a full inventory of what was there. Bills, receipts, tax records going back further than I could quite believe. Harold was a meticulous record keeper. Everything in its place, everything labeled in his block print handwriting. I worked through it all carefully and didn't find anything that alarmed me. At the time, that felt like reassurance. Later, I would understand it differently. Harold's important documents weren't in that cabinet. They were in a manila envelope in a filing cabinet in Columbus. He had already made sure of that. On my last morning at the farm, the morning I was due to pack my bag, load my car, and make the 3-hour drive back to Ohio, I came downstairs just after 6. Earlier than usual. I hadn't slept particularly well and I wanted coffee before I had to think about anything else. The kitchen was quiet. My father was still asleep. The early light was coming in through the window over the sink, that thin gray-blue light that March mornings have before the sun gets any real height. I filled the coffee maker and stood waiting for it, looking out at the driveway, at the oak trees, at the fields beyond. And then I saw the letter. It was on the kitchen counter, close to the coffee maker, in the spot where Harold used to stack his mail. An envelope, standard business size, already opened, the flap torn back. It was addressed to Carter at the farm's address. The return address in the upper left corner was a law firm, 2 surnames hyphenated together, the kind of name that suggests a mid-sized regional practice rather than a large city firm. I did not recognize it. I did not pick it up. I did not unfold the letter inside or attempt to read it. What I did was look at it for a moment, and in looking at it I could see, without touching it, the first few lines of the letter visible above the fold where it had been opened and left. The firm's letterhead. The date. A reference line that contained, among other words I couldn't quite make out at that angle, the phrase property assessment. I stood there for 2, maybe 3 seconds. Then I reached past it, poured my coffee, and moved to the other side of the kitchen. I made breakfast. Eggs, toast, the same simple routine Harold had kept for decades in that kitchen. I ate at the table by myself. I washed my plate and my cup and dried them and put them away. I went upstairs and finished packing my bag. I said goodbye to my father, who was up by then, standing in the kitchen in his robe looking tired and smaller than I was used to him looking. I hugged him. I told him to call me if he needed anything. He said he would. He did not meet my eyes when he said it. I loaded my bag into my car. I backed down the driveway slowly, the gravel crunching under the tires the way it always had. I looked at the house in the mirror as I reached the road. White farmhouse, orange-red barn, the oak trees along the drive, the same as it had always looked, unremarkable to anyone passing by. I pulled out onto the road and pointed my car toward Columbus. For the first hour of that drive, I didn't think about it directly. I listened to the radio. I watched the Indiana landscape move past, the flat fields, the bare tree lines, the grain elevators rising up every few miles against the sky. I stopped for gas just past the state line and got back on the highway without letting my mind settle on anything specific. It was somewhere in the second hour, with Ohio beginning to replace Indiana on either side of the road, that it all started to arrange itself into something coherent. A law firm's name on the envelope, property assessment, 2 cars in 10 days, both of them professional vehicles, both of them moving around the property as though they were evaluating it rather than visiting it. My father not meeting my eyes. My father saying probably just someone turning around to his plate. The pieces were not subtle. They had never been subtle. I had simply been giving everyone the benefit of the doubt because I was grieving, and because grief makes you want to believe that the people around you are doing the right thing, because the idea that they are not is one more loss on top of all the others. But somewhere on that highway, in the gray Ohio afternoon, I stopped giving the benefit of the doubt. Was moving on the farm. She had started before Harold was in the ground a week. She had a law firm involved, and she had people walking the property, and she had my father, whether wittingly or not, running interference for her at the dinner table. And she had done all of it while I was right there in that house, sleeping in the room at the top of the stairs, assuming that the people around me were simply grieving. I drove the rest of the way to Columbus with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. I did not call anyone that night. I did not make any decisions. I simply went home, unlocked my apartment, set my bag down inside the door, and stood in the hallway for a moment in the particular silence of returning to a space that has been empty for 2 weeks. Then I walked to my home office, sat down at my desk, and looked at the filing cabinet in the corner. The manila envelope was in there. The one Harold had given me 14 months ago and that I had never opened. The one he had slid across the kitchen table and told me to keep somewhere safe. I did not open it that night either, but I looked at the cabinet for a long time, and something shifted, something quiet and internal, the way a decision sometimes makes itself before you consciously make it, and I understood that whatever was in that envelope, I was going to need to know. Tomorrow, I told myself. In the morning, when I had slept and the drive was behind me and my hands were steady. Tomorrow I would open it. I slept better than I expected to that night. I think my body had simply decided it was done, that the 2 weeks at the farm and the drive home and the weight of everything I had been carrying had used up whatever reserves I had left, and it shut me down whether I was ready or not. I woke up at 6:15 to gray morning light coming through the bedroom curtains and lay still for a moment, remembering where I was, remembering everything. And then I got up, put the coffee on, and went to my home office. I sat at my desk. I looked at the filing cabinet, and then I opened the drawer and took out the manila envelope. It was lighter than I expected. I don't know what I had imagined, something thick maybe, something that felt significant in the hand. But it was just a standard envelope, slightly worn at the corners from 14 months in a filing cabinet, with my name written across the front in Harold's block print. Carter. He had written my full name, which he almost never did. That detail, more than anything else in that moment, was what made my eyes sting. I opened it carefully, the way you open something you understand you are only going to open once. Inside were 2 things. The first was a single sheet of paper, a notarized copy of a property deed transfer, dated September 14, 1998. The document was formal and precise in the way that legal documents are, full of party of the first part language and legal descriptions of boundaries and acreage. But the substance of it was clear and simple. Harold James Carter was transferring full legal ownership of the 40-acre property located at Rural Route 4, Indiana, to Carter. The notary's seal was in the lower right corner. Harold's signature was above it, in the same block print as the envelope, neat and deliberate and completely legible. The second thing was a handwritten note, written on a piece of lined paper torn from the kind of spiral notebook Harold kept on his desk for lists and reminders. 5 lines, maybe 6, in his handwriting. This was always yours. I just needed to make sure the paper said so. The taxes will keep coming in my name for a while, but don't let that confuse anyone. The land is yours and has been since '98. Keep this somewhere safe and don't talk about it until you need to. You'll know when. Granddad. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the desk in front of me and sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. He had done this in 1998. I would have been 8 years old. My parents' divorce was still fresh. My mother was still finding her footing, and Harold had walked into some county office or a lawyer's office somewhere in and quietly, without telling anyone, transferred his land into my name. Not Robert's name. Not into a trust, not into some shared family arrangement. Mine. A child's name on a deed, protected and sealed and filed away, waiting 26 years for the moment it would be needed. The thing that undid me, sitting at that desk with my coffee going cold, was the timeline. He had done this before there was any threat to protect against, before existed in any of our lives, before Harold's health declined, before there was any urgency. He had done it simply because he had decided, at some point in 1998, that the farm should belong to me. That was all. That was the whole reason. He saw something in the future that he wanted to make sure of, and he made sure of it, and then he went back to his life and never mentioned it. I picked up the note again and read the line "You'll know when" and thought, yes, I think I do know when. I called Pat. She picked up on the second ring, the way she almost always does, which has always struck me as one of her most reliable qualities. She is a person who answers. I told her I needed to talk through something and that it was serious, and she said, "Give me 2 minutes, I'm just moving somewhere I can sit down properly." That was Pat. No drama, no immediate questions, just making space. I told her everything. The cars at the driveway, the letter on the counter, the drive home, and then the envelope and what was in it and what Harold had written. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Well, that old man." And the way she said it, not surprised exactly, but deeply, quietly unsurprised, told me she had always known Harold was capable of exactly this kind of deliberate, protective action. She had just never had occasion to see it activated. Then she asked me the question I had been sitting with since the highway. She asked it plainly, the way Pat does everything. "Does your father know what he's doing?" I told her the truth. I genuinely didn't know. And I told her that not knowing was the part of this that was hardest to sit with. Not's calculation, I could understand calculation, even if I didn't respect it. What I couldn't fully absorb was my father's silence. The not meeting my eyes at dinner. The too smooth explanation about the car in the driveway. Whether that was active participation or passive avoidance or something in between, I couldn't tell. And at that point, I honestly didn't know who to trust, which is a strange and disorienting thing to feel about your own family. Pat listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I wasn't going to do anything yet. I was going to find a lawyer first. I spent the next 2 evenings researching property and estate attorneys in Columbus. I wanted someone local, someone I could meet with in person, someone with a track record that I could verify independently rather than just taking on faith. I found Greg through a legal advice forum. His name came up multiple times in threads about property disputes and deed complications, always with the same description. Thorough, straightforward, doesn't waste your time. I called his office the next morning and got an appointment for the following Thursday. I brought everything. The 1998 deed transfer, Harold's death certificate, the handwritten note. I put them in a folder in the order I thought would be most useful for someone seeing them for the first time, which is a habit from work that I defaulted to without thinking. Greg's office was on the 4th floor of a mid-rise building downtown, clean, organized, nothing on the walls except his degrees and a small framed print of some kind near the window. He was younger than I had expected, early 40s, with the particular quality of stillness that I have come to associate with people who are genuinely good at what they do. He shook my hand, offered me coffee, and then sat down and read through everything I had brought without speaking for about 4 minutes. When he looked up, he said, "The transfer is clean. This is a properly executed and notarized deed. As of September 14, 1998, this property belongs to you." He explained it carefully, walking me through each element in the kind of precise, unhurried language that makes complicated things feel navigable. Because Harold had transferred the deed in 1998, years before any estate planning, years before the farm had never been part of Harold's estate at the time of his death. It couldn't pass through probate, couldn't be claimed as an inherited asset, couldn't be sold by anyone other than me. Legally, it was as simple as that. But then he explained something I hadn't fully considered, which was Weiss' assumption had gone unchallenged long enough for her to get this far. Harold had continued paying the property taxes in his own name after the 1998 transfer. It was just what he did. The bills came to the farm, he paid them, and he never updated the tax records to reflect the deed change. Which meant that from the outside, from any surface-level administrative view, the property still looked like Harold's. His name was still on the county tax rolls. The farm was still locally associated with him, had looked at the surface and assumed it matched the substance, and she had moved quickly enough, found a developer, engaged a law firm, initiated a sale before anyone pulled the actual deed history and checked. Greg paused here and told me the part that changed everything about my timeline. The title company involved in the sale had not yet completed their full deed history search. It was standard procedure. Every title company does one before closing, but it takes time, and they hadn't finished it. Which meant that right now, in this moment, the sale was proceeding on the basis of an assumption that the deed search would eventually contradict. When the search was completed, the title company would find the 1998 transfer, and the sale would collapse on its own. And this was the critical part. If I wanted to control the moment and the outcome, if I wanted to be in the room when it happened, rather than letting it unravel quietly in some administrative office without my father or ever fully understanding what had attempted, then I needed to wait. The closing meeting was approximately 6 weeks out. Greg told me that walking into that room with the 1998 deed would not just stop the sale. It would expose the entire attempt in front of the developer, the title company representative, and my father, simultaneously and permanently. There would be no ambiguity about what had happened, no version of events where could manage the narrative afterward. He asked me if I could wait 6 weeks. I told him yes. What I did not tell him was that waiting was not the hard part. I had been waiting my whole life, in one way or another, for things to resolve themselves into clarity. The hard part was carrying this knowledge through 6 weeks of ordinary life, going to work, paying my bills, calling my father every few days as though everything was normal, while knowing exactly what was coming and saying nothing about it. Greg told me clearly, do not contact, do not alert my father, do not reach out to the developer or the law firm. Let the process run. He would prepare everything we needed. I would simply need to show up. I agreed. We shook hands. I drove home. The waiting period had a texture to it that I find difficult to describe accurately. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of tension you see in movies, where the protagonist is constantly on the edge of breaking, constantly in danger of revealing themselves. It was quieter than that and in some ways harder. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I called my father on Wednesdays and Sundays, the same schedule I had kept for years, and I kept those calls warm and unremarkable. I asked him how he was sleeping, whether he had eaten properly, whether anything needed doing at the farm. He answered in the same vague, slightly distracted way he had been answering since Harold died, like a man with too many things running beneath the surface to give any of them his full attention. It was on a Wednesday call, about 3 weeks in, that the moment happened that I have thought about more than almost anything else in this entire story. We had been talking for maybe 10 minutes, nothing significant. He had mentioned something about the gutters on the farmhouse needing attention before spring, and I had told him I'd look into it, which was a strange thing to say given what I knew, but I said it anyway because it was the kind of thing I would normally say. And then he went quiet for a second. Not a natural pause. A different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight to it. He said, "I just want you to know that." And then he stopped. I did not fill the silence. I waited. After a moment, he said, "It's just been a lot to manage is all." I said I understood. I asked him how he was sleeping. He said fine, not great, the usual. The call ended a few minutes later in the normal way: "Take care of yourself. Talk soon. I love you." I set my phone down on the kitchen table and sat with that half sentence for a long time. He had started to say something. He had gotten 4 words in and chosen to stop. And those 4 words, "I just want you to know," were not the opening of a sentence about gutters or grief or the general difficulty of managing an estate. They were the opening of something else entirely. Something he looked at directly for 1 second and then decided to walk away from. I have turned that moment over in my mind more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer about what it means. Whether my father knew the full extent of what was organizing, or whether he knew only pieces of it and had told himself those pieces added up to something acceptable, or whether he had simply allowed things to happen around him the way he had always allowed things to happen, choosing the comfort of not asking questions over the discomfort of knowing the answers, I genuinely cannot say. What I can say is that he knew something. He started to tell me, and he chose not to. And whether that makes him complicit or simply human is not a question I have been able to answer cleanly, even now. What I did with that moment was file it away. The same way Harold had taught me to file things, not by forgetting them, but by putting them in the right place and leaving them there until the right time. Greg called me in the 4th week with the confirmed details, had signed a formal letter of intent with a developer named, operating through a company called Land Holdings. The agreed price was $1.2 million for the full 40 acres, with the intended development being a residential subdivision. A closing date had been set. The title company's deed history review was still incomplete. Everything was in position. I thanked Greg and told him I would be there. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a moment, and then I opened my filing cabinet and took out the envelope again. I laid the 1998 deed and Harold's notes side by side on the desk in front of me and looked at them for a while. I thought about him in 1998, going somewhere official and quiet and signing my name onto a piece of paper that I would not find for 26 years. I thought about the fact that there had been no conflict to motivate it. No developer, no letter of intent on a kitchen counter. Just Harold, making a decision about what should happen to his land and acting on it without announcement or explanation. He had done the work before the threat existed. He had made sure the paper said the right thing so that if the day ever came when it mattered, all I would have to do was open a filing cabinet and show up. I folded the documents carefully and put them back in the envelope. I set the envelope beside my bag for the morning. I booked a motel 30 minutes from the title company, a clean, unremarkable place, nothing fancy, just a bed and a reliable alarm clock. I confirmed the reservation. I closed my laptop. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I slept without anything unresolved running underneath it. There was nothing left to figure out. Harold had figured it out in 1998. All I had to do now was walk through the door he had left open for me. I drove to Indiana the evening before the closing meeting. I didn't want to do the 3-hour drive on the morning of, didn't want to arrive rushed or tired or carrying the residue of a long road. I wanted to arrive settled. So I drove out on Monday evening, checked into the motel I had booked, ate a decent meal at a diner 2 blocks down the street, and went to bed at 10 o'clock like someone who had nothing unusual scheduled for the following morning. I slept well, better than I had any right to. I met Greg at a coffee shop near his hotel at 7. He was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a folder open in front of him and a coffee he had clearly been working on for a while. We shook hands and sat down, and he walked me through the documents one final time, not because either of us needed the review, but because that is how Greg operates, methodically, completely. He had 2 copies of the 1998 deed transfer, both formally reproduced from the county records. He had the legal notice asserting my ownership. He had a letter addressed to the title company requesting the immediate halt of all sale proceedings pending deed verification. Everything was organized in the order it would be needed, and labeled in the precise way of a man who has done this before and understands that clarity, in a room full of people who are about to be surprised, is its own form of authority. We went over it once. He answered the 2 questions I had, both of which were minor. Then we finished our coffee and drove separately to the title company office. It was a Tuesday morning in late April. The sky was overcast but dry, the particular flat gray of a Midwest spring day that hasn't decided yet what it wants to do. The title company occupied the ground floor of a small professional building on the main street of a town called Carver, about 12 miles from the farm. I had driven past it once before, years ago, without knowing what it was. I sat in the parking lot for 2 minutes after I arrived, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be still for a moment before going inside. I thought about Harold. I thought about September 1998. I thought about a piece of paper sitting in a county record's office for 26 years, waiting quietly, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Then I got out of the car and walked in. Greg was already in the lobby. We were shown to the conference room at 9:57. And my father were already seated when we walked through the door. Was on the near side of the table, to the left, straight-backed, composed, in a dark blazer with a silk blouse underneath. Professional. Prepared. She had a leather portfolio open in front of her and a pen resting across it, and the overall presentation of someone who had arrived early because arriving early was part of how she managed situations. My father was beside her. He was wearing a button-down shirt that looked slightly too large for him, the way clothes sometimes do on men who have lost weight without fully acknowledging it, and he had the particular exhaustion of someone who had not been sleeping well for weeks. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. He looked, honestly, like a man who was present in the room, but not entirely sure he wanted to be. Across the table sat, and a younger associate I didn't recognize. Was in his late 50s, solidly built, with the easy, settled posture of a man who had been in many rooms like this one and found them unremarkable. His own folder was open in front of him. He looked up when we entered with the mild, assessing attention of someone registering new variables. The title company representative, a woman in her 40s named Sandra, whose nameplate was on the table in front of her, sat at the head of the table. She had a laptop open and several printed documents stacked neatly beside it. When I walked in, looked up, and there it was, that fractional shift I had been expecting, that single unguarded moment before the composure reassembled itself. A tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stillness, half a second long, like a system encountering something it hadn't accounted for and processing it at speed. Then it was gone. She said my name in a tone of mild, pleasant surprise, the kind of tone that implies your presence is unexpected but entirely welcome, the kind of tone that suggests she had absolutely nothing to manage. She said, "I didn't know you'd be joining us." I said good morning and sat down. Greg sat beside me. Neither of us elaborated. Sandra began the standard opening, introductions, a brief procedural overview, a confirmation of the property address and the terms of the proposed transaction. She was midway through this when Greg placed the legal notice on the table directly in front of her. Quietly, without interruption. The way you set something down when you want it to be noticed but not dramatized. Sandra paused and looked at it. Greg introduced himself by name and said he was representing Carter in her capacity as the legal owner of the property at Rural Route 4, Indiana. He said this without preamble or apology, in the same unhurried, organized tone I had heard in his office 6 weeks earlier. Then he placed the deed copy on the table beside the legal notice and stated, clearly and without editorializing, that the property subject to the proposed sale had been legally titled in my name since September 14, 1998, pursuant to a properly executed and notarized deed transfer from Harold James Carter. He noted that the title company's own deed history search, when completed, would confirm this finding independently. He stated that the sale could not proceed without my consent and signature, which I was not providing. Then he stopped speaking. He did not look at, he did not address. He simply sat back and let the room absorb what had just been placed in it. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt longer. Reached across the table and picked up the deed copy. He read it carefully, the way a businessman reads something that has just changed the terms of a transaction he thought was settled. His expression did not change dramatically. He was not a man who showed surprise easily, but I watched him read it through twice before he set it back down. Then he just looked at her, quietly, without accusation and without warmth. Sandra asked to be excused for a moment and left the room, taking the deed copy with her. My father was looking at the table. He had not looked up since Greg began speaking. His hands were in front of him, slightly clasped, and he was very still in the way that people are still when they are working hard to keep their expression neutral. His composure held. I want to be precise about this because it would be easy to describe it as cracking, and it didn't crack, not visibly, not in the way that makes for a satisfying scene in a movie. What it did was cost her something. You could see the effort of it, the way you can sometimes see the effort behind a smile that has been held too long. She was working. The polish was intact, but the ease behind it was gone, and what was left in its place was something more mechanical. Set the deed copy down and said to her, quietly and without theater, "Were you aware of this prior transfer?" Said she was not. No one responded. There was nothing to respond to. The paper on the table said what it said, and it had been saying it since 1998, and no one in that room had the standing to argue with it. Sandra returned approximately 4 minutes later and confirmed what Greg and I had already known for 6 weeks. Proceedings could not continue pending full verification of the deed history, which would take several business days. The sale, as currently constituted, was halted. Closed his leather folder. He did it deliberately with both hands and then set those hands flat on the table in front of him. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it was the gesture of a man who had just closed a door on something and was now deciding, calmly and without drama, what came next. His associate gathered her papers without speaking. Beside, I heard my father's chair shift slightly against the floor. The room was very still. I spoke once. I looked at my father directly at him, not at the table, and I told him I would call him later in the week when he was ready to talk. My voice was even. There was no edge in it, no satisfaction, no punishment. I meant it exactly as I said it. I would call him. We would talk. We would find our way through it, the two of us, in the halting and imperfect way that people who love each other but have failed each other tend to find their way through things. He looked up at me then, just briefly. And whatever was in his expression, regret, relief, shame, some combination of all three that I couldn't fully read in a single glance, I held it for a moment and then let it go. I did not look at again. I stood, and Greg stood beside me, and we thanked Sandra for her time. She said she would be in touch. We walked out through the lobby and into the flat gray April morning, and the door closed behind us. The meeting had taken 23 minutes. I stood in the parking lot for a moment and breathed the outside air and thought about Harold in 1998, signing a piece of paper in some quiet office without any idea that 26 years later it would be placed on a conference table and end something before it could begin. He had known when. He had always known when. The weeks after the closing meeting were quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic fallout, no phone calls full of accusations, no confrontation at a family dinner that forced everything into the open. Life, as it tends to do, simply continued. And the absence of drama was, in its own way, the clearest signal that it was over. From any further negotiation within the week, I learned this through Greg, not through any direct communication, was a businessman, and businessmen do not chase deals that have dissolved at the foundation. He had no appetite for a title dispute on land he could not legally acquire, and from what Greg conveyed, he had asked very few questions and moved on very quickly. That told me something about how the original conversation had been framed, but that was not my problem to untangle. The law firm had been working with also stepped back without contact. No letter, no call, just silence, which was its own kind of answer. Was intelligent enough to understand that she had no ground left to stand on, and that the only thing pressing further would accomplish was a deeper and more public exposure of what she had attempted. So she didn't press, and I did not reach out. What happened between and my father in the weeks that followed is genuinely not something I know, and I have made a deliberate choice not to speculate. That is their marriage. Those are their conversations to have, their damage to assess, their decisions to make about what comes next. I have enough of my own to manage. My father called me 8 days after the meeting. I had been expecting the call and had not been rushing it. I meant what I said in that conference room, that I would wait until he was ready. When he called, his voice had that careful, slightly formal quality that it gets when he is trying to be honest about something uncomfortable. He told me he had not fully understood the extent of what had been organizing. That he had assumed the farm would go through probate the way these things normally go, and that was simply helping to manage the process efficiently. He said he should have asked more questions. He said he was sorry. I listened to all of it. I sat with it, and I told him the truth, which was that I loved him and that we would find our way through it. I did not tell him I believed him, and I did not tell him I didn't. Both of those responses felt like they would close something that needed to stay open for a while longer. Some things take time to fully understand, and my father is one of them. About a week after that call, a letter arrived from Greg's office. Formal confirmation, on letterhead, that all sale proceedings had been permanently withdrawn, that the title company records had been fully updated to reflect my ownership, and that the matter was resolved. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and then filed it in the cabinet where the manila envelope had been, in the folder Harold labeled, in my imagination, things that stay where they belong. The thank you note I sent Greg took me 3 drafts, not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because every version felt smaller than what the situation deserved. In the end, I kept it simple. I thanked him for his precision and for understanding that some things needed to be done at exactly the right moment and not a minute sooner. He sent back a single line. It was my pleasure. Take care of that land. I have kept that note. On a Saturday in late May, I drove back to the farm. I let myself in with my key, and I want to say that clearly, because for the first time in my life it felt entirely, unambiguously true, my key. I walked through the house slowly, through the kitchen and the hallway and the living room, room by room, the way you move through a place when you are trying to memorize it. It was quieter than I had ever known it, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the specific absence of one person. But it was still itself. The kitchen still smelled like old wood and coffee, and something underneath both of those things that I have never been able to name but have always recognized. I made a cup of coffee, strong and black, no apology, and took it out to the front porch. I sat in Harold's chair and looked out across the 40 acres in the late May light, the fields just beginning to green up properly after a long winter, the oak trees along the driveway full and steady the way they have been for 80 years. I thought about Harold in 1998, sitting across from a notary somewhere, signing my name onto a document that I would not find for 26 years. I thought about what it means to be loved by someone who does the work before the threat exists, who protects you before you even know you need protecting, who says nothing about it and simply makes sure the paper is right. I have not decided what to do with the farm yet, whether I will keep it as it is, rent the land, restore it to something working. I am in no rush. That decision will come when it comes, and I will make it the right way at the right time. What I know is that it is mine. It was always mine. He just made sure the paper said so. The thing I have carried out of all of this, and I've thought about it a lot in the months since, is not anger. It is something closer to gratitude. Not for what happened, but for what it revealed. That the people who love us most quietly are often doing more than we can see. That protection does not always announce itself. That sometimes the most important thing someone ever does for you is something you don't find out about until you need it. Harold never told me he had done this. He just did it. And when the moment came, it was enough. So I'll ask you, and I genuinely want to know, so please leave it in the comments. What would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have waited the way I did and said nothing until that room? Or would you have confronted the moment you understood what was happening? There's no wrong answer. I just find myself curious about where other people would have drawn the line. Thank you for being here for this one. It meant more to tell than most.